There's a 90-second window, beginning the instant something startles or upsets you, during which a hormone floods your brain and quietly overwrites the way you will remember the next several minutes of your life. Most people never learn this window exists, but your hippocampus knows it intimately because it happens to be the structure that takes the hit. Let's go straight to the cellular level, because that is where this story actually lives. The moment a threat or a strong emotional stimulus is detected, your amygdala fires a signal to your hypothalamus, which triggers your adrenal glands to release cortisol into your bloodstream. Cortisol reaches the brain within roughly 90 seconds. Once it arrives, it binds to receptors that are unusually dense in one particular region, the hippocampus, the structure responsible for forming new, long-term memories. Research published in the journal Nature has shown that elevated cortisol in this window does not simply heighten emotion. It actively interferes with how memories are encoded, which is why people often have crystal clear recall of the emotional peak of a stressful event, but strangely fragmented or missing memory of the ordinary details surrounding it. This is the cortisol cascade, and it is one of the most precisely studied stress mechanisms in modern neuroscience. This goes far deeper than anything you'll find in a 7-minute conversation with your doctor or a quick wellness article promising to help you manage stress. Your doctor does not have time to walk you through receptor binding in the hippocampus. A magazine will tell you stress is bad for memory. Almost nothing will tell you the actual sequence, mechanism by mechanism, of what is happening inside your skull in real time. So let's go there. The first mechanism is glucocorticoid receptor binding. The hippocampus contains some of the highest concentrations of cortisol receptors anywhere in the brain. When cortisol binds in large amounts during that 90-second spike, it temporarily impairs the hippocampus's ability to consolidate new information into stable long-term storage. The second mechanism is the inverted U effect. Researchers studying memory and stress, including work referenced by Harvard Medical School, have found that a small amount of cortisol can actually sharpen memory and focus. But beyond a certain threshold, the relationship flips, and additional cortisol begins actively degrading memory formation. This is why a little pressure can make you sharper, while a sudden shock can make your mind go blank. The third mechanism is amygdala dominance. During the cortisol spike, the amygdala, your brain's threat detection center, essentially takes priority over the hippocampus for processing resources. Emotionally charged details, a face, a tone of voice, a single sentence, get burned in vividly. Meanwhile, mundane surrounding details, what you were wearing, what time it was, what came right before, often never get properly filed away at all. The fourth mechanism involves working memory disruption. Cortisol elevation has been shown in studies referenced by the Journal of Neuroscience to temporarily reduce activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for holding information in your conscious working memory. This is the biological reason people often say their mind went blank during a sudden stressful moment. The prefrontal cortex was quite literally operating with reduced capacity. The fifth mechanism is memory reconsolidation interference. Every time you recall a stressful memory later, your brain briefly destabilizes it before restoring it. And if cortisol is elevated again during that recall, the memory can actually shift slightly each time you remember it. This is part of why retold stories of stressful events sometimes change subtly over the years, even when the person telling them is being entirely honest. Let me try to make this invisible process visible. Imagine your hippocampus as a court stenographer typing a transcript of your day. Under normal conditions, the stenographer types calmly, capturing details in order. The instant cortisol floods in, it is as if someone burst into the room shouting. The stenographer's hands freeze on the most dramatic words being shouted, typing them in bold capital letters, while everything quieter happening at the edges of the room goes completely unrecorded. That's why you can remember the exact words someone said to you in anger, but not what the room looked like or what you said back. This matters enormously after the age of 55. Research on aging and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the system responsible for producing cortisol, suggests that the body's ability to shut off a cortisol response once triggered becomes less efficient with age. Cortisol levels in older adults often take longer to return to baseline after a stressful event, according to data referenced by the National Institutes of Health. This means the memory-disrupting window may last longer than 90 seconds for an aging brain, and may also partially explain why older adults sometimes report feeling that a stressful moment stayed with them, cognitively, for hours afterward. Not just emotionally, but in terms of genuine difficulty recalling fine detail. So what do you actually do with this? Here is the simple, almost embarrassingly practical insight. If something important needs to be remembered accurately, whether it's medical instructions from a doctor, details from an important conversation, or directions you need to retain, the worst possible time to absorb that information is in the 90 seconds immediately following a stressful or emotional spike. Pause. Take a few slow breaths. Let the cortisol curve begin to come back down before you try to lock in details you'll need later. This single habit, simply waiting before committing new information to memory during a heightened state, has real grounding in how your hippocampus actually functions. But here is what almost nobody tells you, and it reframes everything we have just discussed. This cortisol memory mechanism is not a flaw in your brain. It evolved for a reason. Vivid, prioritized memory of threat and emotional peaks kept your ancestors alive by making sure danger was never forgotten, even if the boring details around it were. Your hippocampus is not malfunctioning when it does this. It is running ancient, brilliant survival software, optimized over millions of years, on hardware that is now being asked to navigate doctor's appointments, difficult phone calls, and family arguments instead of predators. If you zoom out far enough, there is something almost staggering here. Every vivid memory you carry, the moment you heard difficult news, the instant before an accident, the second a loved one said something that changed everything, was shaped by the exact same 90-second hormonal cascade we have just walked through. The intensity of the memory is not random. It is your biology marking what mattered. Your most powerful memories are not malfunctions. They are your hippocampus, doing precisely what evolution built it to do, keeping what matters most burned into the architecture of who you are. What we've covered today is drawn from peer-reviewed neuroscience research and is intended for educational purposes. It is not a substitute for medical advice. If memory changes are a significant or ongoing concern for you, please speak with your doctor, since persistent memory difficulty can have many causes that deserve direct medical evaluation. If this finally explained why you remember some moments in painful, perfect detail while losing others entirely, send this to someone who has ever said, "I don't know why, but I never forget that moment." Their hippocampus was simply doing its job. Next time, we're going somewhere even stranger. What actually happens inside your body in the half second before you fall in love? And why your heart may know before your brain does. There is a related phenomenon that most people have experienced without ever knowing its name: flashbulb memory. This term, first introduced by psychologists in the 1970s and since refined through decades of cortisol research, describes the strangely vivid, almost photographic memories people form during moments of intense emotional significance. Where were you when you heard a piece of devastating news? What did the room look like in the seconds after a loved one told you something that changed your life? These flashbulb memories feel more reliable than ordinary memories, more detailed, more permanent. But research referenced by the Journal of Neuroscience has found something unsettling. Flashbulb memories are not actually more accurate. They simply feel more accurate because the emotional intensity stamped onto them by cortisol creates a powerful sense of confidence, even when specific details have quietly shifted or been lost entirely. This has a second, lesser-known consequence. Because the amygdala prioritizes emotional content over peripheral detail, two people who lived through the exact same stressful event can walk away with genuinely different, equally vivid, and equally confident memories of what happened. This is not lying. It is not faulty character. It is simply two hippocampi under two slightly different cortisol loads, each doing triage on what to keep and what to let go. Understanding this can be quietly transformative, particularly for couples or family members who have spent years arguing over whose version of a difficult memory is the real one. Often, both of you are right, and both of you are also, in small ways, wrong, because that is simply how a stressed brain encodes experience. There is also a quieter form of this same mechanism that plays out not in dramatic moments, but in ordinary daily stress, the kind that accumulates from financial pressure, caregiving responsibilities, or chronic worry. Research on allostatic load, the cumulative wear of repeated stress activation, suggests that frequent, smaller cortisol spikes can have a compounding effect on memory over months and years, even without any single dramatic event. This is part of why periods of prolonged stress, a difficult diagnosis in the family, a financially strained season, a long caregiving stretch, are so often remembered afterward not as one clear story, but as a kind of fog, vivid at the edges and strangely blurred in the middle. The cortisol was working the entire time, just more quietly. Knowing this changes how we might think about memory itself, not as a flawless recording device, but as a living, adaptive process shaped moment by what your body decided mattered. It means that the gaps in your memory are not failures. They are evidence that your nervous system was triaging, protecting, prioritizing the entire time, even when you weren't aware it was happening. There is a kind of grace in that. Your mind was never trying to deceive you. It was trying, in its own ancient and imperfect way, to keep you safe. There's also a pharmacological dimension to this story that deserves attention, particularly for an audience navigating the realities of aging. Certain medications commonly prescribed to adults over 50, including some corticosteroids, certain blood pressure medications, and some sleep aids, have been shown in research referenced by the National Institutes of Health to interact with the same cortisol pathways we have been discussing. This does not mean these medications are dangerous. It means the relationship between memory, stress, and the hippocampus is even more interconnected with your overall physiology than most people realize, and it is part of why conversations with your doctor about memory changes should always include a full review of what you are currently taking, not just an assumption that memory naturally declines with age in isolation from everything else happening in the body. There is also a fascinating protective factor hiding inside this same system. Researchers studying resilience and memory have found that people with strong social support networks tend to show a blunted cortisol response to stressful events compared to people facing the same stressors in isolation. This is sometimes called social buffering, and it appears to work through the vagus nerve and the broader autonomic nervous system, the very systems we explored in our discussion of grief. In practical terms, this means that simply having someone beside you during a stressful moment, a hand on your shoulder, a familiar voice in the room, can measurably reduce the cortisol spike itself, which means it can also reduce the disruption to memory formation that follows. Connection is not just emotionally comforting, it is, quite literally, neuroprotective. There is one more layer worth understanding, and it concerns sleep. Memory consolidation, the process by which short-term memories are converted into stable long-term storage, happens largely during deep sleep, particularly during a stage called slow-wave sleep. Elevated cortisol, especially when it remains high into the evening hours, has been shown to suppress slow-wave sleep, according to research referenced by sleep scientists at institutions including the National Institutes of Health. This creates a kind of double penalty after a stressful day. Not only does the original cortisol spike interfere with how the memory was encoded in the moment, but elevated evening cortisol can also interfere with the overnight process that would normally help stabilize whatever memory did get formed. This is part of why advice to avoid dwelling on stressful events right before bed is not simply emotional wisdom. It has a clear basis in the biology of memory consolidation itself. Taken together, these mechanisms tell a story that is far richer than stress is bad for memory. They describe a finely tuned, ancient triage system, one shaped by hormones, by sleep, by the people around you, and even by what is in your medicine cabinet, constantly making split-second decisions about what deserves to be remembered and what can safely be let go. Your memory was never meant to be a perfect archive. It was built to be a survival tool, and understanding that distinction may be one of the most freeing pieces of biology you encounter all year.